So I'm Alysia Kwiatkowski. I am the program director for the Internal Medicine Residency Program. I also work in our Medical Education and Educational Research Institute, specifically on educator development and on some medical education-based research. I am a clinical rheumatologist, and I see patients over at Erie County Medical Center. Dr. Meka, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Dr. Kaye. Jennifer Meka. I am the director of the Medical Education Research Institute, and I'm at the Jacobs School of Medicine and also have an appointment in the Graduate School of Education. And I am a trained educator and have a variety of different roles, but primarily spend my time working with our students, our residents, and our faculty with all things related to teaching and learning and helping to improve their skills and abilities within all of those areas. Thanks for joining us today and for the series, for those of you who are here for multiple sessions with us.
And Dr. Meka and I are proud to have Dr. Kaye joining us as well, the real Dr. Kaye. So Matthew, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Absolutely, thank you. I'm Dr. Kaye. I'm currently a recent graduate from the internal medicine program here, and I'm currently serving as the chief medical resident at the University of Buffalo over at Erie County Medical Center. I'm also a part-time hospitalist, board certified internist, and I do about 1 week a month on the inpatient service, both on the teach and non-teach side. And I am about to complete my master's degree in health science education. So really excited to be here to present.
All right. And with that, we will get started. So today we're going to be talking about backward design and critical thinking, specifically focusing on the creation of effective learning objectives and mapping that onto how we assess if our learning objectives have been met. So we hope that at the end of the session, you are able to develop an understanding of the role that backward design plays in the curriculum development process, that you explain what backward design is and why it's important, to describe the stages, to specifically describe levels of Bloom's taxonomy and develop learning objectives to promote higher order thinking, to discuss the importance of learning objectives and key principles for developing those to support student learning. And lastly, to be able to describe the importance of aligning assessments with objectives through backward design. So to get us started, I thought we would ask you a chat box question, or if you're feeling brave, you can unmute your mic and share with us verbally. But what are some ways that you have seen or that maybe you use in your own practice in education for engaging learners in higher order thinking? How do you get them to do those most difficult tasks?
Well, I'm not sure if this is the right answer or not, but I'm hot on this topic. That sounds good. But giving students doing things like escape rooms and having two-step questions where they answer a part of a first question and then have to use a higher order thinking skill to answer the second part of that question would be a way to get students engaged.
Yeah, so actually two different things you're talking about. So using gamification, which is something that we use pretty actively in our program, as a way to really engage the learners, make it fun, and can be at a higher level of thinking, especially in terms of, having a learner identify something, but then having them apply what they've identified in a two-part question, whether through gamification or not, is an excellent way to involve them in different levels of thinking, including higher order. So thank you for sharing that. A couple of things in the chat talking about creation. And so I think Dr. Meka and Dr. Kaye would agree that creating something is really one of our highest levels of thinking. So creating a project, creating products, modeling and coaching, excellent. So has the learner achieved a level where they've mastered some content and now they're able to teach fellow trainees or fellow learners or coach near peers or peers in achieving those same goals? So I really love that. We use that a lot in the work that we do in our program. Discussions, yes. Can they connect multiple sources of information into logic and meaning? So are they able to bridge and connect the information that you've required them to learn, or maybe that you've taught them, for a higher level of understanding. Maybe it's application, maybe it's to create meaning, but a really excellent point there as well. Yes, and another comment in the chat about breaking down more complex concepts into plain language and then trying to, again, build those connections and construct meaning, right? And constructivism, constructing meaning from some of the information that's being presented to them at possibly a lower level. So that's really great. Dr. Meka or Dr. Kaye, any additional thoughts on the work that you do to add?
So I think that a lot of the things are already captured here, but I really like the idea of also including opportunities for as near as authentic experiences that you might be able to do as well. So being able to help to translate how people might actually be able to need to use that knowledge and that skills, or those skills in real life or in more authentic situations. Not that gamification and other things aren't a great way to engage learners in that as well, but to also think about ways you might extend that into things that might mirror or be close to future practice.
So looking at this slide, this will be sort of our roadmap for our session today and our session next time. So can you clearly define higher order thinking for yourself and for your learners? After that, are you able to identify your goals and your objectives? Plan instruction that includes opportunities for active learning, and then make sure that in the end, there is alignment between those objectives, assessment, and instruction. So these are the things that we're going to be talking about over the next couple of sessions. So first, in being able to clearly define higher order thinking for yourself and for your learners. So as an exercise, we would like you to take a couple of minutes independently and choose a topic that you teach. I know many of you teach in different domains and maybe multiple domains within the work that you do at our university, but choose a topic and write one question or one task that you would like your learners to be able to achieve after you have taught them the topic. So we'll give you guys about 2 minutes to independently do that. And when you're done, if you could just throw a thumbs up or just put in the chat that you completed it. Give everyone maybe 30 more seconds. So we're thinking of a topic that we teach or that we have taught and writing one question or task, question for your learners to have answered by the end, or a task that you would have liked them to be able to achieve by the end of your time teaching that topic. Okay. I think we can bring it back together. And I'm going to ask you to share in just a second, but moving on to this. This is our first introduction today to Bloom's taxonomy, which you will be increasingly more familiar with as we progress through our session. And you can see here that there's different circles or different levels, right, of learning and higher order thinking here. And so at the most rudimentary, right, remembering, can a student or a learner recall the information? And you can see all the way to the right of your screen, these are some verbs that you may think about using in order to define, whether or not a learner is able to broadly remember within that category. And as you work your way up to the outer circles, I know many of us in the beginning and many of you mentioned creation. And you can see here that creating is at the highest level here. Right? And can they create something? And you can see some of the verbs that sort of go along with this. So I'll give everybody a couple, maybe a minute and a half or so to take a look at this and determine at what level was that question or was that task that you had just written down at. And then we'll ask for, a few people, or as you're thinking about this, if you feel brave enough to put that task and that level in the chat, it would be wonderful to see some of your examples. So we'll give you a couple minutes to determine what level are they at, and what was your example. Dr. Meka also included a great resource in the chat that you can take a look at as you're thinking about this. And we will be sharing some additional resources today in the chat. So if you could, we'll let you know when we put something in there, but just making sure that you have access to it to take a look. So seeing one great example, reviewing a set of functional requirements and coming back with the most important question for the users. So we're at, a review level there, but there may actually be 2 objectives in there. And we'll let you think about that kind of as we progress on. Topic of countertransference, task, describe a time you treated someone favorably or unfavorably because of something you couldn't quite explain. Perhaps something like intuition, a vibe, or a vague sense of familiarity with a level of understanding. That's a really wonderful, very specific example. So that's great. Any others want to share? Asking students to create one multiple choice question specific to basic statistics concept based on their real life situation. Very nice, kind of a flipped classroom approach there, and asking the learners to actually be involved in the creation of their own learning objectives. So that's, I know we do something similar with our first year medical students, and that's a really, nice example of a flipped classroom approach in terms of what we're talking about. Analyzing data and applying new knowledge gained. We're talking about informatics here. Applications, domains, and ethics in a real world setting. So combining 2 levels in, and actually perhaps even 2 objectives into one, both at a mid to higher level. And Dr. Meka did include some additional Bloom's resources in the chat, which you can reference as we progress today or save for future use. So thank you to all of you for sharing those. It's off to a great start. So in thinking about now identifying your goals and objectives, right? So we're thinking about how do we define specifically what we want our learners to know. And that brings us to the notion of backward design and understanding by design. And some of you may be familiar with this, may have had this concept introduced in different sessions. If not, then you'll have a wonderful introduction today with some useful tools on how to apply this. So, there's really 2 big ideas here that we teach and assess for understanding and transfer, and that through backward design, we're planning backward from the end, and that end is true understanding and transfer. I know that, for me, prior to being familiar with understanding by design and backward design, when I had to go and, give a topic-based presentation, the very first thing that I would do is pull up a blank PowerPoint and sit at my desk and think for a few minutes about how I wanted the session to be structured. So I started immediately with session design, and I'm sure that many of you do that or have done that, and guilty here as well. But then once I came to understand more about this concept, I realized that there was a better and even more efficient way to approach things.
And part of what sometimes, similar to what Dr. Kwiatkowski is just explaining, is in terms of thinking about like educational activities. If you're planning for a course or an overall program, you might be excited about some of the different things that you might have learners do and some of the speakers that you might have, when ultimately the most important thing to be asking yourself is, what is it by the end of this course that you want your learners to be able to know, understand, do, apply, et cetera. And again, looking towards some of those higher level objectives so that you can be really thoughtful and deliberate and intentional about setting students up to be successful in achieving those ultimate goals for the course and program.
So here are the 3 stages of backward design. So we mentioned identifying your desired results, which we do through the creation of learning objectives. Many of our colleagues gave some examples of great learning objectives that they use or that they just put together in our last chat box conversation. You also noticed at the beginning of the talk and at most talks that you attend, that second slide after the title slide are the learning objectives, right? So that's step 1. Step 2 is to determine what the acceptable evidence is. And this, we're talking about evaluation and assessment. How are you going to assess the learners so that you know reasonably that your learning objectives have or have not been met? And then lastly, actually planning the learning experiences and instruction. And here we're talking about session design. So where many of us, still do or formally would start with session design, it's really the last step here in the 3 stages of backward design. There's a bunch of different templates available to you, and we can share this one with you as well when we send out the materials from today. But it's helpful, I find, to have a template to really kind of map out what things are looking like and what the overall session plan is or course plan or whatever you're designing will come to be. And so you'll see here that you have your goals, you have your learning objectives. We're talking about understanding and what are the essential questions that students should be able to answer to really demonstrate that they have understanding and meaning. And then same thing if there's any skill acquisition that you would want to have involved. In the second portion, thinking about evidence and assessment, and then what the actual learning plan, what are the learning events, what's the learning instruction, what are the learning activities. So I'm going to share a video, and hopefully this will play okay.
Backward design is a useful framework.
Can you hear it?
To build a college course. This framework contains 3 parts: objectives, assessments, and learning activities. These 3 elements work together to help create a course that can have a legacy long after the end of the semester. But what makes it backward? Where you start is what makes it backward. The common approach when designing a college course is to start with the stuff. You grab a textbook, and if you're lucky, it's broken into 16 chapters, and you can just cover a chapter a week for the semester and call it done. Ta-da! Instant course. That's a very common approach, but I would argue it's problematic for 2 reasons. Reason number 1, you're the expert in your context, not the textbook publisher. You know your discipline, your department, your university, and your learners better than the publishers. It's not that I think that they're just trying to exploit the tension of an academic's limited available time to sell you their products. No, or maybe I do. The instructor, not the textbook publisher, is in the best position to see the ultimate value of the course and to create something meaningful with their learners. And reason number 2, when you start with content, you're looking at the things of the course, not the destination. It's like preparing to go on vacation by first packing your suitcase. I've got sunscreen and a book to read and a sweater in case it's cold and some extra socks. I mean, I don't know where I'm going yet, but my suitcase is packed. That's what makes backward design backward. You don't start with the suitcase, you start with the destination. The first step in backward design is creating objectives. It's imagining a time when the course is over and then asking, what is it I hope that students will have learned that will still be there and have value 2 years after the course is over? Your learners are long gone. What do you want them to still know and be able to do from your course? This is your vision for the course, where you dream beyond the 16 weeks of the semester. I've been asking faculty that question for a decade, and I have never heard the response, I want my learners to have read chapter 4 in their textbook. Think bigger than your content. And how you answer that question forms the basis of the learning goals, or the objectives. Objectives are simple statements that define your vision for the course from the perspective of your learners. My learners will be able to identify the forces involved in fluids at rest, describe public health as a system, identify the steps to developing a youth leadership development program plan. When you have your objectives, you move on to the second step, which is creating assessments. Begin by asking yourself, what would the learners have to do to convince me that they had achieved those objectives? The process of working out the answer to that question clarifies the real meaning of the learning objectives as you create the assessments. And the more honest your objectives are, the more authentic your assessments can be. Meaning, the projects you ask them to engage in actually look like the work of the discipline outside the classroom. So if your objective for your learners is identify the steps to developing a youth leadership development program plan, you can have your learners meet that objective in an authentic way by creating an actual youth development program that they could implement in their lives outside the class. That's an authentic and meaningful assessment. So you have your objectives and your major assessments. Then you move on to the third step, which is crafting learning activities. Here's where you ask yourself, what would the learners need to do during the course to be able to do well on these assessments? You know where you're going. You know what it would look like for your learners to get there. And now you're planning out how to prepare your learners for that journey. This could be readings from a textbook, video lectures, conducting experiments, guest presenters, or anything that helps your learners master what they need to master. Figuring out the content of the course is the last step in backward design. Now, you need all three elements for this process to work. If you don't have explicit objectives, your assessments and your learning activities, they may be enjoyable, but they will lack an obvious purpose. Without assessments, how will you know if your learning activities prepared your learners to reach and possibly reach beyond your objectives? And without learning activities, well, you miss the opportunity to help your learners practice their skills and are functionally setting them up to fail. These three elements are connected and continually interacting with each other. While I've presented them to be fairly linear, in practice, there are always revisions along the way, especially with objectives. Starting with the textbook is a very common practice when designing a course. But the tension is that you're starting from the stuff as opposed to the vision. It's not that starting with the topics you want to cover is wrong, so to speak, but what if starting with content actually limits what you really want your students to learn? Backward design asks the question, what is it I hope that students will have learned that will still be there and have value 2 years after the course is over? It gives you a framework to build towards that vision, creating a learning experience that has a legacy long after the end of the semester.
Okay, so want to know, what are your initial thoughts about the backward design process? Was there anything that really resonated with you or anything that was surprising to you in watching the video? And feel free to unmute your mic or share some of your thoughts in the chat. The video, specifically spoke to a course, but all of the same principles can be applied to a session, to a workshop like today, or even at a higher level in terms of an overall curricular design at your school.
And if you were already familiar with backward design, but maybe hadn't seen this particular video explaining it, it might just be instead of something that is an initial thought, a good reminder, or something that was presented in a way that maybe you hadn't thought about before if you're already familiar with the topic or had used that approach previously yourself.
One thought in the chat that inherently it makes sense, especially the so what factor. I think something for me was, the notion about 2 years from now, is there anything that you hope that they still have with them, or thinking about where they may be applying that knowledge 2 years down the road? That was something for me that this video particularly emphasized, which I don't often think about.
I agree. We call those enduring understandings in education. And so it's really important that it's not just those picking details, it's the larger big ideas that are the most important things so that they keep them.
Yes. So breaking it down into the three main components and emphasizing the three main components. Interesting question in the chat. How much of a concern is bias when developing meaningful objectives? And I do think that in any work that we do, right, there's always the opportunity for bias. And bias can be at a lot of different levels. It could be your own personal bias in creating this. It can be bias of your curriculum in terms of what the curriculum wants you to put together or wants you to emphasize. So I think there's always an opportunity for bias to work its way in. And in the session that we're going to do next week, we're going to give you some tangible tools that you can use to reflect on your learning objectives, your assessment modalities, and on your session design to try to mitigate bias when possible. So stay tuned, more to come on that, but a really insightful and important question, and thank you for asking it. Useful and motivating to look towards the future from the learner perspective, needs, expectations, and values. Very true. Making sure that the learner knows what they should be getting out of the session, right? So that they can focus in on key content that's presented or just know where they need to be. Knowledge comprehension versus real world applicability, also true, right? And they did mention textbooks a lot in this, and we don't all use textbooks as part of our education. Many of us do refer to a standard text, but there are resources such as Up to Date, right, in the medical nursing world that people will use, and other online databases. And so that's kind of analogous to some of the mentioning about textbooks and the reliance on textbooks. So Thank you for that. Now to transition to a bit of a deeper dive on learning objectives themselves. And I will turn it over to Dr. Kaye to get us started with this.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kwiatkowski. So learning objectives, we're talking a lot about these and especially how important they are when you're designing something starting with the objectives to make sure that you hone in on these objectives really is one of the most critical steps. And it's also important from the learner's perspective to have a clear understanding of what they are expected to have gained after completion of the session or of the curriculum. Learning objectives, broadly speaking, need to tell the learner what they should be able to do after they have participated in that teaching session. And again, learning objectives really are focused on outcomes and are typically learner-centered. So from the learner's perspective, what is expected of them? Writing learning objectives can actually be quite a challenge, especially writing good learning objectives and clear learning objectives. A few things that you might want to think about as you're determining what objectives you are setting for your learners. The first thing that you might want to say is, okay, after attending this session, what do I want my learners to be able to do as a result of this session? So what information that I'm imparting during the session do I want them to be able to do? What do I want them to be able to do with it? Another question you should ask yourself or can ask yourself is, what do the learners that are attending your session need to know already to be able to bridge that gap between before and after attending the session or the course? And I think another good goal to set for yourself, and one of the final questions that you should ask is, if I only wanted my learners to take 3 things away or do 3 things as a result of this course, what would those 3 things be? And that's really a good way to hone down how to start writing objectives for a course.
And one of the things that oftentimes people will struggle with and will have questions about is thinking about things like, if you have an overall vision and mission, and then you have your goals and objectives, and how do these things all relate to one another? Do they have to, what is the alignment imperative there? What should we be aiming towards or working for? And so if you think about it this way, in terms of an inverted pyramid in which your mission is going to be very much broader, your goal is going to be usually pretty broad as well. And there might be some goals for the overall curriculum, the program, the course, as well as even for the session, but they might not be as easy to measure and be as specific. Whereas your objective is going to be something that you really want to have be more specific and certainly be measurable. So if you think, for example, about the university here, we have the overall University of Buffalo's mission, which is related to being able to, bring the benefits of research and scholarship, creative activities, and educational excellence to communities, and to impact and positively change the world. And then you would be thinking about what your goal for your particular, whether again be a program, curriculum, course, or even an individual session, what that might be. And you want to be thinking about how your course goal or your program goals might align or to help further or support the achievement of that mission. But the goal would be something that's going to be a little bit more broad. So if I think more specifically about maybe a curricular component, and you say that you are, as a result of your course, for students to develop essential leadership and teamwork skills. That would be an example of a goal. And then your objective might be something more specific about, for example, that students would be able to define characteristics of effective leaders, that they might participate in reflection and use data and information, maybe from leadership or teamwork surveys or 360 or degree evaluations or other tools to develop a greater awareness of their skills currently as leaders, and to create their individual learning plan for how they might further develop their skills as a leader. So thinking about things that we're going to be more broad, again, is going to be a goal which would help to develop that essential skill. And then more specifically, what would you be doing or asking students to be able to do as a result of participating in the curriculum or activities? So if you look again back at Bloom's taxonomy, and you saw through some of the things that we've sent through the chat, as well as the slide previously, that there are many different visuals and ways that people might represent it, and some things might resonate more with you than others. So again, if we look at another triangle or pyramid here, Bloom's taxonomy, the original version, it used a little bit of some different language, but basically you look at that Our lower order thinking skills, sometimes called LOTS, are going to be things that we're like remembering or recall, understand. And then as you move up the pyramid here in the taxonomy, we're getting to higher order thinking skills and things that you might not be able to do immediately, but rely oftentimes on having been able to have achieved some of the scaffolding from moving up those levels. So when you start to look at things like to evaluate or to create, in order to be able to do those things, you inherently need to understand or have a basic level of knowledge or appreciation for some of the elements or characteristics of whatever the content might be that you are incorporating within your course or within your session. And again, as you look at thinking about the different levels of Bloom's taxonomy and using that to translate it into practice, again, you want to be trying to look for some of those different verbs or some of the language that is measurable. So one of the things that we often will see is people will initially in their brainstorming come up with things like understand or maybe appreciate, which how you have to then ask the question, how would someone demonstrate that they understand it? And then that's where you would start from in order to work towards more clearly defining what your objectives are.
Yeah, and I think another really important point is that the pyramid, and it's kind of going to be exemplified here, you know, the pyramid of Bloom's taxonomy, those individual layers themselves, those words are really not very specific and really don't make for great learning objectives, things like remember or understand or even create. But when you're writing objectives, and there are some examples that we've shown and will continue to show, you really want it to be a very specific and measurable action under that sort of domain. So here would be an example of how you might start writing a learning objective. So the first thing you need to do is to specify an observable behavior that you want to see in your learner and what the object of that behavior is. So an example of this objective that you might think of would be, at the end of this course, students will be able to write a research paper. So that's a pretty good objective, but it's maybe not quite specific enough. So we can broaden that to say, at the end of this course, students will be able to write a research paper in the appropriate scientific style. But even then, we might want to further hone in on the actual conditions under which we're expecting our learner to do this particular action. So our final learning objective could be something like, at the end of their field of research, students will be able to write a research paper in the appropriate scientific style. And the verb that you choose there is really important here. The verb is write, and that's something that's measurable. So the 5 criteria of a good learning objective, as we've said, it has to be specific, something that's a specific action that I can point to and say, this is what I want them to do at the end of this session. It should be measurable. And again, like Dr. Meka said, things like saying understand. So at the end of my lecture, I want students to, let's say, understand, you know, the cellular communication mechanisms of the neuron. Well, that's not really measurable. It's hard to measure someone's understanding, but there are ways to measure someone's understanding. And those are the verbs that you're going to want to focus on. Again, it should be observable, kind of similar to measurable, something that you can see and have a way of evaluating. It should be achievable. Within whatever time frame that you want them to achieve. It doesn't have to necessarily be right at the end of the course or of the particular class, but maybe it's either by the end of the course or by the end of the semester or even by the end of their degree. And finally, it really should be something that's behaviorally based, something actionable.
So we're going to go into our first breakout room exercise, and we will put these objectives into the chat for you so that you're able to see them while you are in your breakout rooms. We will also put the link to the AMC's document on learning objectives so that you can see a lot of different examples of verbs that, you know, can be used. But in your small groups, if you could, you know, take the next 5 minutes and comment on the objectives. Are these objectives strong or are they weak? Why? And how could you potentially revise them? So while Catherine is getting the breakout room set up, I'll just read them to you and you can take some initial thoughts. So describing the location of the heart in the thorax and mediastinum, understanding how to critically evaluate the scientific literature, identifying the steps of how to run an immunohistochemical assay, explaining their purpose and consequences of what can go wrong. So whenever we're ready, we'll launch the breakout groups and give you about 5 minutes to talk about this. Okay, I think we have everybody back together with us. A couple of your colleagues accidentally hit the leave button. They did not mean to be rude, so we'll apologize on their behalf if somebody exited the room quickly. But interesting to hear. We can take maybe the first objective. Describe the location of the heart in the thorax and mediastinum. Did you all feel that this was a strong objective or a weak objective? You could just throw it in the chat.
Looks like most people think this is a weak objective.
Yes, I think we would agree with them. What are some things we could have done to make it a bit stronger? Does anybody want to throw a revised version in the chat or state one way to make this objective a little bit better based on what Dr. Kaye just went over with us? Specifics, so anatomical terms. Yeah, what is meant by location, the location of the heart and mediastinum, in relative to what, right? What part of it? What exactly are we talking about here? So specifics in terms of anatomical anatomical terms. Yep. Some suggestions, actually having the learner mark a location of a certain part of the heart or, mark a certain vessel, thinking about better verbs, expanding this out to include more than one item. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty big objective, right? To describe the location of the heart. Like Dr. Kaye, who's going to be a cardiologist, could probably take the next hour of our talk to describe to us the location of the heart. So what exactly are we really asking? How can they demonstrate that they can describe the location? Great question. And what time frame? When do you want them to be able to do this? At the end of gross anatomy? At the end of a whole course dedicated to anatomy? Or at the end of your 1 hour lecture? So great. Any other thoughts about this one?
Does anyone want to rewrite it and share a revision of it that might be better?
We have a good one. List the major organs surrounding the heart. That's good. Yeah.
You could even make that even more specific to maybe say, list 3 or however many you might want to be expecting to see as well.
Yeah. Dr. Monegro, demonstrate how to obtain parasternal long view of the heart on ultrasound. Perfect. Okay, let's move on to the next. Understand how to critically evaluate the scientific literature. What did we think about this one? Was this weak? Was it moderate? Was it strong? What do we think about this one? You can just throw it in the chat. Too vague. Some agreements there. Lots of agreements there. So are we saying it's weak? Yep. Okay, everybody agrees. It's very broad. It's a weak objective. It's too vague. Anybody want to provide one suggestion on how to make it a bit better? How do we feel about that verb choice? Not so great. Maybe that's what we're alluding to is kind of vague. How do you measure understanding? Dr. Kaye told us that, understand is the broader level, but like all the specific verbs that you could use mapped out to that are more easily accessible. So I think that's one way, but there are many ways to evaluate scientific literature. Evaluate the scientific literature how? According to what? Is there a rubric you want them to use? Is there some sort of evaluative method that you think that your learners should be able to do? Exactly. Identify the criteria for evaluating. Perfect. Explain the process of evaluating scientific literature, provide 5 key threats to validity, and identify in the following example. Yeah. Distinguish between reliable and unreliable sources for health information. Perfect. All right, now to the last. Identify the steps of how to run an immunohistochemical assay. Explain their purpose and consequences of what can go wrong. What do you guys think about this one? Is this a weak one? Is it moderate? Is it strong? What do we feel? Have one for strong. A couple votes for strong. Okay. I think we would agree it is the strongest one of the three that we have up there. Is there a way that we could still potentially make this better? Listing the steps, yeah, can still be approved, agree. Do you feel like this is more than one objective? Yes, that maybe this could be split up into two or maybe more objectives, right? Identifying the steps or listing the steps of how to do an immunohistochemical assay. It's probably an objective by itself. If we can, identify how many steps and put whatever time period in, then that's a pretty solid learning objective. Presents highest specifications, yep, ties into assessment, yep, having the learner demonstrate their thoughts of potential problems and solutions, yes. So for all these reasons, it is strong, but could even think about separating those two sentences into two even stronger, well-worded, specific, accessible objectives. So really great work on this. Now, we talked about this. So for the next 3 minutes or so before we switch gears more fully onto assessing our learning objectives, to have all of you write an effective higher order learning objective. So maybe it's that task or that question that you asked in the beginning of our time together today. You could use that and think about how you may reword that, or you can think of a brand new one, but we'll give you maybe 2 minutes or so, 2-3 minutes to think about in a course or in a session, or you could even do our session today if you don't have one that comes to the forefront of your mind. What's an effective higher order learning objective? And we may, ask you if you're brave enough to share, but why don't we first take a couple minutes and put one together?
All right, so love to hear if people are comfortable with sharing some of what you came up with the group. If you feel comfortable, you can certainly unmute yourself, or if you want to put some things in the chat. Thank you so much. All right, so seeing a couple coming in. Thank you. So effectively demonstrate aseptic technique for biological safety cabinet use in a competent and efficient manner. I think the one question that I would pose in terms of that is, what specific order will the participants know what a competent and efficient manner is? Or do you need to maybe more clearly describe that? And if that's already been designed for whoever might be attending or participating, or is clear based on that, that's okay. But that was one of the things as an outsider, I am not sure that I would know exactly what you'd be looking for there. Okay, have another few coming in here. I'll give people a chance to read that over and think a little bit more about where that might fit in. And of course, looking at these just in isolation without the context of knowing about the course or the curriculum makes it a little bit difficult, but explain the fundamental question driving your proposed project. I really like the idea of explaining it, because oftentimes you might just include the question or define the question or describe or list the question. But I like the idea of helping people to make some of their thinking visible, which again, of course, helps us to move at getting to some of those higher order thinking skills as well.
I like the word, correctly identify. You can identify things, but are they correct? So I think that that's a nice adverb there, actually, that we don't often think about, and specific in terms of what sort of cancer treatments. Yeah, list the different risk factors associated with pulmonary embolism. Could make it a little more specific by saying list 3 or 5.
Or if there are a variety of different types of risk factors that you want them to look, across potential contributors to that, you could potentially include that too, in addition to, or instead of, a specific number that way.
Great job with this. We'll ask you to hang on to them. We're going to transition a little bit now into assessment, but remember, it's really key to have alignment between your objectives and your assessment. So after the next few slides of discussing different assessment modalities, we're going to ask you to revisit this objective and think about how you may assess it. So you can keep that in the back of your mind as we start to review assessment.
So assessment can certainly be a huge large discussion, and we're only going to be doing a short introduction to it in some activities here with it this evening. But as Dr. Kaye said, that one of the most important things is thinking about that alignment and ensuring that there is that alignment between your overall objectives and the assessments and the ways that you are asking for, expecting your participants to be demonstrating that they have met the objective and met it to whatever criteria or expectation you've defined for them. So if you would to think for a minute about what are some different ways that you might assess if learning objectives are met? Are there things that you have done in your own teaching experiences or in workshop sessions that might move beyond things like what you would expect for things like maybe potentially multiple choice exams? Love to hear other things that people have incorporated or potentially participated in yourself as well.
Or things that you may be excited to try.
One of the areas that I think is a lot of fun to explore is allowing for participant or learner created portfolios that might bring in different, I'm going to say, evidence or items that they believe demonstrate that they have achieved the objectives. So identifying what the objectives are and giving them some guidelines around things that they would need to then put together a portfolio to demonstrate that they have achieved those objectives and include an explanation or rationale for that.
Rubrics is one that's
Yes.
coming up in the chat. Yep.
Absolutely.
One thing for me recently, Dr. Kaye and I are currently working on our master's in education, and a lot of what we're doing is asynchronous learning. And so, a lot of part of the course activities have been creating, short descriptions of reading assignments and what's been impactful for us, but also making sure that we're asking our peers in the course a question based on the learning or based on an area of uncertainty for us. So that was a new sort of assessment modality that I hadn't been so familiar with, now being involved in asynchronous and online learning about discussion prompts and appropriate response and questioning from discussion prompts. And then the rubric that's been provided to us by our course instructors on how they're going to evaluate those assignments has been interesting to look at, and something I was not familiar with.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing that example. And I also see some pre and post test questionnaires. You could also have some pre and post test problem sets or different types of cases or activities that they might be completing. I think that also, one of the things that you mentioned too are these discussion boards. So sometimes reflections and having written reflections on learning or about their learning and application of knowledge or transforming it or using it in different ways. Again, that might require a rubric as well. E-portfolios, absolutely. Writing a short code for creating an alert. Yes. Case studies, absolutely.
And one fun one, we mentioned gamification. One of our colleagues mentioned gamification in the beginning. We like to use this, we have some escape room models. So the assessment there is, could they escape the room? Did they have enough of the knowledge and were they able to make enough connections to solve the puzzles to escape the room? So even in something as fun as gamification, there's assessment that can be built in throughout.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things to keep in mind too, that with that component is you can include both somewhat about more things focusing on process versus just ultimately content or skills, so that you could be looking at participation and engagement in some of those activities along the way, as well as some type of more evaluative type of judgment about whether or not they developed that skill to the extent they needed to, or were able to, correctly apply their knowledge in different ways. Yes, lots of different examples there. So thank you all so much. Now, when we think a little bit about assessment, one of the things that we oftentimes do is to sometimes conflate it with evaluation. And so when we think about evaluation, we can be thinking about different models for evaluation. One of the most famous individual models that we use, and that many actually different domains, specialties, and even public sectors utilize Kirkpatrick's level. So this was developed in the 1950s. Donald Kirkpatrick had identified and was trying to develop as part of his dissertation research an evaluation training model. And basically, when you look at the levels, sometimes again represented as a pyramid. So you'll see that image sometimes reflected here with Kirkpatrick in addition to Bloom's. And looking at the lower levels being those that are easier to obtain often when it comes to getting evaluation data, as well as incorporating assessments into these different levels of evaluation. So level 1 being reaction. So did the learners like it? Level 2, knowledge. Did the learners get anything out of it? Level 3 being a change in behavior. So will learners do anything differently as a result of it? Are they changing that? Level 4, looking more at outcomes. So what impact that actually has, and really trying to get at, was the activity, was the curriculum, was the program, was it worth it? What are some of those long-term? And of course, level 4, being able to look at some of those outcomes is going to be oftentimes the most difficult to be initially collecting evidence around or collecting data for, as well as just making sure that you're able to more precisely be able to map some of the outcomes, or I'm sorry, the impact of participation in that course, session, curriculum, program to those changes. So if we look at level 1, reaction, did the learners like this? This is where you see a lot of times similar things. Perfect timing there with that, Catherine, because when we look at like an end of session evaluation, where you're asking whether or not they felt as though the workshop met the objectives, or they feel like the speaker's presentation, the material was clear, and so forth. These are often presented with Likert scale types of questions, and we'll tell you a little bit more about the pace, the flow, motivation, connection, engagement, and so forth. But again, this is coming from the participant's perspective, and oftentimes is not going to necessarily be anchored in more or less subjective types of experiences there. Whereas when we go to level 2, that's when we're starting to try to work towards things that are a little bit more objective. And these are usually tied to some form of assessment, right? So if we're looking at knowledge and knowledge acquisition and wanting to know if participation in the session, the workshop, the course, if that had any change in knowledge. And that again would be looking at including things like multiple choice questions, oral probes, direct observations, post-test survey designs, and so forth. Those are the things that you would start to then be able to more concretely see if there was a change in an increase or addition to whether that's knowledge or skills.
And as a little foreshadowing, one way to do this is to think about something called an exit slip strategy. This is an active modality. And, when we talk next week and discuss theories behind active learning and adult learning theory, this is one potential thing that you could use. So an exit slip strategy is used to help learners process new concepts, reflect on information shared, express their thoughts about new information. Learners respond to a prompt that's given by the presenter and submit their answers. Can be electronically, can be on a form of paper. And then you can choose to follow up on the learner's responses by emails, maybe in the next class session, can help you gauge, clarifying some uncertainties at the beginning of that next session, and as a way to end the day or the course or the workshop in an active way. One specific example for this could be the 3-2-1 format, where a presenter instructs learners to jot down and share with a partner or in a small group 3 key ideas or issues that were presented, 2 examples or uses of the information covered in their everyday lives or in the work that they do, and then on one unresolved or remaining question or future question or area of possible confusion. And again, it gives the learners the opportunity to discuss this a little bit, but also could give you some great guidance on what to do in your next session or moving forward. And so these are, an exit slip is a great assessment modality that can be used in a lot of different ways and used to also help you in your session design, which we will expand upon further next time.
And then we get to our level 3 when we're looking at that change of behavior. This really, I would say for the most part, when we think about the majority of our goals for workshop sessions and for courses and curriculum, for the most part, you really want to be looking towards that behavior change, right? So are they able to change their particular, interaction with, other individuals, or being able to make commitments to change, commitments to act, actually seeing that, direct change. If you are trying to do, an intervention, for example, with, increasing or changing hand washing behavior, do you actually see more participation in that, and less where you would not have incidents of that occurring? Or if you're looking at something as simple as incorporating a different type of anticipatory set into your instruction, does that actually then happen in the majority of your teaching sessions after that, or whatever it might be that you're trying to incorporate and to do? And there's a question. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Dr. Kaye.
I was just going to say, to really emphasize alignment here, because if you have selected a lower order thinking verb as part of your learning objective, and now you're on a Kirkpatrick level 3 of behavior in terms of doing a chart review or looking at commitments to act, or directly observing, one of the people in your lab do a complete experiment on their own, well, then there may be some malalignment there between such a high level of Kirkpatrick and a lower order thinking in Bloom's taxonomy, right? So this is where, in thinking about assessment, alignment becomes really important, especially as you move on to a level 3 and a level 4 in terms of assessment modalities. Are your learning objectives really there to require this level of assessment? It's a question to ask yourself.
Absolutely. And I see Carl asked, made a comment about change in the type of questions they ask. Absolutely. So if I think about, for example, we do a workshop to help faculty better participate in academic coaching with students. And so when you think about the types of questions they ask, and when it comes to a learning history, as well as their current learning behaviors, I would assume that as a result of participating in that workshop, that there would certainly be a change in the types of questions they ask, as well as how they use that information to inform the individual learning plan that they come up with the learner. So yes, absolutely, that could be incorporated as something that you would see in a change in behavior. And then level 4, again, is outcome. So what will future benefit be from that particular activity or from that session? So those are some things that you might be looking at in terms of, overall increase or change in health professions education. It might be patient satisfaction. It might be something related to their ability to better teach back or improve those communication skills, and see that then be a change overall in terms of how people might be exploring or considering different topics, and their perception of or their reactions to those as well.
And so, in the sake of time, it's about 10 after. So I think for this one, we can give you, about 4 to 5 minutes in your groups. And again, we'll put these in the chat, and this will be a 2-part. You can pick 1 or 2 of these and discuss with your group, how are you going to assess this? What are some examples of assessment? But then we do want you to spend a couple of minutes on that objective that you wrote, how you might assess that, and share that with the group. So I think picking one of these that you want to talk about potential assessment modalities, and then sharing some thoughts about how you might assess your own learning objective. So we'll let Catherine launch the groups, and then we will drop these into the chat for you.
Great, I'm launching them now.
All right, everybody, welcome back. While you were there, question about the upper level Kirkpatricks being applicable outside of the clinical realm. They're applicable in every realm. And we gave some examples of that in the chat, but essentially, more substantial changes that are seen at the level of the community are something that are measurable and reproducible, potentially sustained. And so, thinking about the piloting industry, right? It was they had all of those new restrictions put into place for pilots, their work hours, and what was their end result, right? At a larger level, it was that there was improved safety and less issues with, emergencies and things sustained in air traffic. So that's an example from a different industry, but they're generalizable to every industry in every realm. So thank you for asking that and giving us the opportunity to expand upon that a little bit more. Quickly for these, I think we'll just have you throw it in the chat for these first 3, if you discussed any particular assessment modalities that could be used. So for the first one, formulating a research question or hypothesis by the end of the course. What are some assessment modalities that you may think about using to assess whether this objective has been met? A written assignment, yep. And maybe that written assignment goes with a rubric formation. So, perhaps it's creation of a rubric in terms of what were the essential components of the research question or hypothesis that can be shared with the learners at the beginning of the course. So great. Any other thoughts about this one? And move on to the next. Describing the functions of organelles of a typical cell by the end of the session. What do we feel like would be an appropriate assessment modality for this? Type of assessment will be based on how many learners you have in your course and your bandwidth to assess, of course, practical considerations. You can say in an ideal situation, if you had freedom to control both of those things, what would you like to assess this with? For this one, multiple choice comes to mind for me. I've been in courses like this, right? Thinking back to all along my education, and a multiple choice question or a short answer question may be, well suited for this type of assessment. And then the last one, kind of more challenging, demonstrating awareness of how one's beliefs, values, and conflicts of interest may impact patient care by the end of nursing school. Any thoughts for how this could potentially be assessed?
I think a case discussion or a group discussion reflective thing at the end of a clinical experience would be helpful.
Yeah, a case discussion, especially if it's directly observed, right? A directly observed case discussion. Something that comes to mind here for me would be like an objective structured clinical exercise or some direct observation, which can be in a case-based format. That's a great suggestion. Anybody else thoughts on this one?
I remember in nursing school, we spent a lot of time delving into many different possibilities with this in terms of prior experience, whether positive or negative, such as working with patients that have been in prison and things like that. And so we actually had journals that we wrote into and for self-reflection, and had small groups to discuss basically our thoughts on the matter and how we would think it would impact positively or negatively and how to react in that situation. And if you felt that you couldn't give the 100% equal care and what to do in that situation. And of course that would be or in our case, we're taught to notify that another nurse needs to take over for the sake of quality care. But that was how my school approached it.
Yeah, a lot of wonderful things you mentioned there, so that high level of participation, right? You're journaling and you're sharing in a small group format, and being able to participate fully in those types of activities arguably is a demonstration of this, right? Role playing would be another consideration, or, are students able to state what they should do if they are unable to do these things? The example you provided would be, to call an additional nurse to cover for them, and maybe that could be worded in a descriptive answer or multiple choice question for that specific aspect. So a huge spectrum here for different ways to assess this. And likely for this one, there may be multiple different assessment modalities in order to be able to state, has this been effectively demonstrated? E-portfolios, a couple other suggestions on here. Does anybody want to share for their objective if they had any thoughts about how to assess it? And you don't necessarily need to relist your whole objective, but you can let us know maybe what some of the suggestions were about assessment, or maybe it was something creative that you hadn't thought of. I know one thing in the work that Dr. Meka and I do focuses a lot on educator development, and one thing that isn't novel, but that we've been meaning to bring to our department and our school is the idea of teaching exercises where you have an experienced educator come and directly observe, maybe a more junior educator or maybe anybody who opts into it, for a day or a half a day and is able to evaluate them based on a rubric and give them some tangible suggestions on their performance that otherwise they may not have known. And I've participated in this, and the feedback that I've received has been, really impactful for me to consider and to want to be able to do this again moving forward. So that's a higher level assessment modality that is something that we've been meaning to really get off the ground, and hopefully we'll do so within the next year.
That's a great example. And one of the other things that I was thinking about is in terms of like our scientific literacy and inquiry curriculum, asking our students to create an infographic for family members that would identify key sources of information that they should use to better understand the pros, cons, and options as it comes to COVID vaccines. And we ask them to do that in small groups and give them some specific criteria with a rubric, but some people might be familiar with that, giving students with a variety of different what we call it raft, so role, audience, format, topic. So if you give them a specific topic, but you might give them some opportunities to have some variation in terms of one of those other elements. So, we specifically ask them to do an infographic, but you could tell them they could potentially do an infographic or write up a brief report or a one-page summary, because maybe they aren't necessarily as excited about using, some different types of design tools, again, depending on what the most important objective is and what it is that you want students to be demonstrating, and again, ensuring that alignment there exists, but then potentially playing around a little bit with some of the areas where they might be able to demonstrate it in a few different formats versus when there's a skill that might more specifically, or knowledge that might need its own very specific way of being demonstrated.
So we spent, as we, kind of conclude our time together today, we talked about how do you define higher order thinking for yourself and your learner. We introduced the notion of Bloom's taxonomy and the different levels that go with it. And within that pyramid or within those circles are, more general terms for all the verbs that you could potentially use to get to those different levels of thinking. And to also then identify what your specific objectives are, maybe what your overarching goals are, but what are your specific objectives? How do you assess those? And next time we're going to talk about actually planning the instruction and to include a focus on adult learning theory and active learning. And we emphasized today a bit about the importance of alignment between objectives and assessment, and making sure that those levels match and your assessments are reasonable for the level of thinking that you've described in your objective. And we're going to map both of those onto what we're using for our learning activities in our next session together. So next time we're going to be talking about creating dynamic and engaging educational sessions. And we will also touch on the notion of bias and how bias can be reflected in the work that you do, whether it's through objective assessment or actual session design. So thanks for being here with us today. And these are our email addresses. If you have any questions, we'll hang out and take them, but we look forward to seeing you next time.
And thank you all so much for your participation and for the questions and comments within the chat as well. So if you have other things or would like other examples, please don't hesitate to stick around or send us a message as well. We're happy to share other examples or connect you with individuals as well who might be able to share some great recommendations. So thank you all.